What's something your parents believe that you don't?
I never thought that after months of holding my life together while my husband served overseas, the real war would begin the moment I stepped back through my own front door, a place I had once thought of as the safest ground I could ever stand on. I had built up an image in my mind of reunion, of the kind of moment you see in movies where the soldier comes home, where arms open, and all the waiting, all the lonely nights, all the sacrifices suddenly make sense. Instead, I walked straight into a silence that told me the story before anyone dared to use words, and when the words finally came, they were spoken by people I loved, people I had trusted more than anyone on earth, and the betrayal burned deeper than any wound. Mark, my husband, had been my anchor, or at least I thought he was, and Ethan, my younger brother, had always been the one I swore I would protect from the world, even when he made a mess of his own life. Growing up, I had defended him against bullies, lied to our parents to cover for him, even slipped him money when he couldn't make rent because he claimed the world was stacked against him. He had this way of spinning a story that made you feel guilty if you didn't bend over backward to help, and I always did. And when Mark shipped out, I never imagined Ethan would be the one to step into my place, not just in the family, but into my marriage. The first sign wasn't even subtle. My mother, who has never been able to keep a secret longer than a pot of water boiling over, looked at me too long when I hugged her, as if she was trying to measure how much I knew already. My father cleared his throat 3 times in a row, a nervous tic he usually reserved for funerals or job interviews. And then Ethan walked in, and he didn't look guilty. He looked smug, like a man who had won a prize he hadn't earned. When Mark followed him into the room, their eyes did not avoid each other, and that told me more than words. My stomach turned before a single syllable left anyone's lips. When I finally demanded to know what was going on, no one rushed to deny it, no one shouted in protest. Instead, my mother had the audacity to put her hand on my arm and say, "Don't overreact, honey. Family comes first." Family comes first, like those words could erase the image that had already lodged itself in my mind, my brother and my husband crossing a line that should have been sacred. My father mumbled something about loyalty and keeping the family intact, but I couldn't hear it clearly over the sound of my own heart pounding so loud in my ears that it made the room tilt. I laughed then, but it wasn't joy. It was the kind of laugh that escapes when you're on the verge of shattering into pieces, a sound sharp enough to cut through their performance of calm. I said, "Family comes first? So that's what you call this circus, family?" No one looked me in the eye, and that told me everything I needed. Mark tried to mutter something about how lonely it had been without me, how Ethan had been there in a way I hadn't, as if holding a household together while worrying every single night that my husband might not come home alive wasn't being there. The excuses floated around the room like smoke, and I knew if I let them, they'd choke me. I didn't throw a plate, I didn't scream, though every bone in my body begged for release. I smiled instead, a thin smile that said, "I see all of you for what you are now." And I realized, in that moment, I wasn't going to let them bury me under their version of reality. If they wanted family to come first, fine. I'd show them exactly what happens when family betrays one of their own. But the cruelest moment wasn't the discovery itself, it was what came after. Because within the week, I was expected to sit across the dinner table as though nothing had happened. Sunday dinner, the weekly ritual where my mother insisted we all gather, became the stage for my humiliation. I was supposed to sit with a plate of roast chicken, smile politely, and pose for the family photo my mother insisted on taking every single time as proof of our so-called unity. She handed me a plate, told me to sit next to Mark, while Ethan sat on the other side of him, grinning like a man who had won without even playing by the rules. I thought maybe they'd skip the photo this time, but of course not. My mother fussed with the camera on her phone, insisting we all squeeze in tight, her words chirpy, but her eyes starting to me like she knew this was gasoline on an open flame. She told me to smile, just one picture for the memory, like a picture of my brother pressed up against my husband would somehow heal the fracture instead of etching it into history forever. And I did smile, because in that moment, I understood that if they wanted me to play along for appearances, I could. But behind that smile, I was already sketching out the first draft of revenge. And as the camera clicked, I knew that photo wouldn't be the memory they thought it would be the evidence of the exact night I decided I would no longer be the fool in their story. By the time the leftovers were packed and my mother had labeled them like museum pieces no one actually wanted, the script for the week had already been written without my consent. Because the phone calls began first thing Monday with my mother insisting that perspective is healing and that men do foolish things when they feel unseen, my father adding in his muted baritone that we should be grateful Mark returned in one piece and that Ethan, for all his flaws, had only stepped into a gap. While I listened with the kind of stillness you learn when standing on a firing range, the sort that keeps your hands steady even when the noise makes your teeth vibrate. And I knew in that steady place that they were testing whether I would swallow the story they preferred because it was tidy, cost them nothing, and let the family motto stay printed on the wall like a church banner no one dared dust. I played along, not because I believed a word of it, but because you can learn more from a liar by nodding than by shouting. So I nodded when my mother explained that Mark had been lost and Ethan had been supportive. I nodded when my father suggested counseling with a pastor who liked to talk about endurance. And I even nodded when Mark said he had been lonely and that I had become all logistics, as if handling the bills, the cracked water heater, and the endless waiting was some sterile occupation that dried me up, though I knew he meant it to land like a kindness. Ethan, emboldened by the chorus, arrived at my door with a smile so polished it squeaked, apologized for crossed wires, and pivoted with the grace of a late-night infomercial host into a favor he claimed would help us rebuild trust. Because if I would co-sign a car loan, just temporarily, he could lock in a better rate, keep his insurance low, and show everyone we were still a team, while I stood there cataloging the shamelessness, as if it were an entry in a field guide, since only a man who never pays his own parking tickets could decide that the most convincing gesture of reconciliation is to ask the person he gutted to underwrite his next shiny mistake. I told him I needed time, and I watched his jaw soften with relief the way it had when we were kids, and I smuggled him out of trouble with teachers by inventing stories about stomach aches and migraines that never existed. And while he was still congratulating himself for winning me back, I began making a few calls of my own, not to plot anything dangerous, nothing illegal, just the kind of polite, administrative sabotage that thrives in fluorescent offices and smells faintly of toner. The dealership he chose was the kind with a coffee bar, a wall of fake awards, and balloons that pretended to celebrate the dignity of debt, and when we walked in together he swanned about like a minor celebrity, pre-selecting a color that sounded like a cocktail and a trim package that promised confidence, all while waving his phone to show off a pay stub I suspected was more fiction than finance. Because Ethan had always been a man who loved a shortcut and had never met a boundary he didn't want to repaint to suit his mood. What he did not know, as he flirted with the saleswoman and asked for a test drive long enough to feel the engine, was that 2 days earlier I had frozen my credit with all 3 bureaus, filed an identity theft alert as a precaution, and notified the dealership's finance office that any application involving my name would require in-person, recorded verification along with employment confirmation and a second contact number, which meant that the form he slid across the desk with his bright pen and confident tilt ran aground on a reef he could not see, because a blinking cursor and a locked file do not care about charm. I let the sales process wind like a parade, watched him accept a plate of cookies, listened while he recited future road trips, as if he were auditioning for adulthood. And I waited until the finance manager appeared with the apologetic smile service workers wear when they are about to read a policy to someone who wanted a loophole, because in that soft voice the manager explained that the cosigner's credit could not be accessed, that the system required a phone confirmation with me on speaker, and that, regrettably, the promotional rate depended on immediate approval, which meant that without the cosigner's unlocked file the application would default to Ethan alone, and suddenly all that confidence needed a chair. He tried to wave it off, asked them to run it anyway, insisted that his pay stub was solid, and learned in the kind of slow, public way that sinks pride like a stone that his solitary rate would be high enough to make the balloons look like accusations. And while he sputtered about timing and fairness, The saleswoman gently reminded him that he had placed a deposit to hold the special order color he would later refer to as Statement Blue, a deposit the form described as non-refundable. A word he had skimmed because men like Ethan believe refunds are the birthright of the persuasive. I did not laugh, because triumph tastes better when it is quiet, and instead I leaned in and said with the kind of bright, helpful tone you use when offering someone a napkin after they sneeze that we could try again in a few months once trust had been rebuilt, that I was sure the family would appreciate his patience, and that boundaries were good for everyone, especially brothers who confuse proximity with entitlement. Then I stood and thanked the team for their time, shook hands like a woman who reads contracts for sport, and walked out into the faintly oily sunlight with the knowledge that he would spend the week trying to explain a vanished deposit to a mother who catalogs coupons and a father who has a calculator for a heart. The revenge was not loud, but it was tidy and it was mine, and while the satisfaction settled in like the first deep breath after a storm, the air shifted again. Because later that night when the neighborhood had gone still and the houses had put on their blue television glow, someone pounded on my door with the entitled rhythm of a man who believes doors exist to be opened for him. And when I looked through the peephole, I saw Ethan on the porch with a face I recognized from our childhood. Moments right before he broke something expensive, his phone lit up in his hand with a string of furious messages from Mark. And in that split second before I turned the deadbolt, I understood that whatever I had set in motion at the dealership had already traveled farther than I planned, and that the next knock might not be his alone. When I finally opened the door, I did it with the careful, deliberate grace of someone removing a bandage from a wound she already knows is ugly, and there he stood with the posture of a man who believes noise beats truth every single time, launching straight into a speech about humiliation at the dealership, about how I had disrespected him in front of strangers who would now gossip about his finances like bored baristas, about how Mark was livid because the deposit was gone and the color could not be transferred, and while his voice climbed and tangled on the porch light, I watched the pattern every liar eventually reveals, that impatient tremor that appears when charm fails and the math starts to bite. So I let him talk himself breathless and then told him, in a voice steady enough to set a metronome by, that boundaries are not disrespects, that consequences are simply housekeeping with better penmanship, and that if he had gambled on my softness, he was late to a table where the dealer had already closed the shoe. He tried to pivot to nostalgia, to the old stories where I saved him from teachers who had finally run out of patience, to the afternoon when I signed a permission slip he had already lost and called it mercy, to the night I walked him home after he mouthed off in a bar and nearly collected a scar he would have turned into legend, and he asked me for one more mercy that would cost me everything and him nothing. Because men like Ethan understand that the person who cleans up is the person who can be dirted. Yet while he wrapped himself in our history, my phone vibrated with a message from my mother chiding me for drama, my father asking me to talk it out over pot roast on Wednesday, and Mark sending a bear line that landed like a pebble in a well, that he could not stand public scenes and that I should stop trying to punish everyone for feeling what they felt when I was all logistics, and in that triangulated chorus I heard the thing they could not say aloud, that my usefulness had expired the moment my steadiness stopped cushioning their appetites. I slept badly, in fits that felt like driving on a shredded tire, and by morning the neighborhood had sharpened, because people who never waved suddenly found reasons to be at their mailboxes. The jogger with the heroic calves slowed by my curb as if his shoelace had tied itself, and the woman with the lemon tree a street over tilted her head with that sympathetic weight that says she knows more than is good for her, so I pulled my hair back, made coffee strong enough to peel paint, and did the one thing I have always done best, which is to gather facts until the noise gives up and find somewhere else to live. The facts were not hiding, they were simply stacked in places no one bothered to dust, in a shoebox my mother had pushed behind paint cans in the garage where she kept holiday napkins and guilt, in county records where late fees grow like ivy, in the friendly emails that payday lenders send when they hope a debtor will mistake a threat for a hug, and in all of it, I recognized Ethan's handwriting, that lazy diagonal that slants into wishful thinking, along with references that listed our parents' landline and, to my surprise, my own number as an alternate contact, which explained the voicemails that had arrived weeks ago with chipper voices asking me to confirm employment details I had never agreed to provide. I did not throw a grenade. I sharpened a pencil, because revenge that leaves fingerprints is just a future errand. So I spent a patient hour drafting 3 certified letters that withdrew permission for any creditor to use my name or my parents' numbers as references for Ethan. That invoked the fair credit rules with the kind of citation that makes a collections agent sit up straighter, that instructed lenders to treat any future reference to me as identity misuse, and that copied the small claims clerk as a courtesy. And when I finished the letters, I put them in envelopes that looked like seriousness and walked them to the post office, where the clerk stamped them with that solemn thunk that sounds like a door closing on a room someone should never have entered. Then I drove to my parents' house with a smile calm enough to be mistaken for surrender, sat at their dining table with the doilies preserved under plastic like relics, and in the same affectionate tone my mother uses to ask whether anyone wants more green beans, I explained that banks have begun asking families to co-own debts through the back door of references, that their savings would be safer in new accounts that require dual signatures instead of the single key Ethan knows how to borrow. That caller identification can be fooled, but paper rarely lies, and I set down a tidy binder labeled housekeeping that contained copies of every letter, a list of lenders already notified, and a simple script for answering any future calls with polite refusal, and I watched comprehension rearrange their faces, my father's anger turning not toward me for once, but toward the son who had converted their patience into his credit line, while my mother, who prizes thrift like a sacrament, pressed her lips together and said she would handle the bank before dinner. The fallout traveled faster than gossip, because by evening Ethan's autopay had bounced like a bad check at a church bake sale. His landlord, who is not sentimental, demanded a cashier's check instead of a promise, and Mark, who cannot abide clutter in any form, found himself untidily attached to a man whose debts behave like confetti at a wind tunnel, which must be why my phone lit up past midnight with a message asking whether we could meet, just the two of us, somewhere quiet where he could ask a question he should have asked a long time ago, and while I considered whether I wanted to offer him the dignity of clarity, a new text arrived from an unknown number containing a photo of a lease addendum with my signature in a tilt that almost matched mine. A lease I had never seen for an apartment I had never entered, and the caption, spare and smug, said only that the renewal is due on Friday and that the cosigner is responsible if the tenant fails to pay. I stared at the crooked angle of my name on that lease addendum the way a jeweler studies a counterfeit diamond, not because I needed a microscope to see the lie, but because the flaw was almost artistic in its arrogance. And while the unknown sender waited for panic or pleading, I felt the quiet efficiency that comes over me when the situation stops being personal and becomes procedural, so I saved the image, pulled the metadata, and forwarded it to a friend at the county clerk's office who has an eye for digital footprints and a memory like a steel cabinet. Then I sat down with a legal pad and mapped a route that did not rely on any single door opening in my favor. Because the trick with men like Ethan is to build a hallway of consequences where every exit leads to the same unpleasant room. First, I called the landlord listed on the document, a man whose voicemail message promised customer service like a handshake from a grandparent, and I left a crisp note that I would be filing an affidavit of forgery by morning, that I would insist on a copy of the original lease packet, including the wet signature pages, and that any collection effort premised on my alleged cosign would be treated as a violation of fair debt rules, which means penalties I would be delighted to explain to a judge who still reads the statute books. Second, I scheduled a walk-in with a notary at the UPS counter by the grocery store with the absurdly cheerful posters about packing tape, because certain kinds of seriousness look better when they smell like cardboard. Third, I texted Mark and told him that if he wanted his question answered, the one about whether there was anything left of us that wasn't just logistics with a heartbeat, he could meet me at my parents' house on Wednesday at 7, and if he believed in truth more than comfort, he should bring Ethan with him and wear a clean shirt, because some memories deserve proper lighting. By noon the next day, the clerk had confirmed that the photo's metadata matched a scanning app used by Ethan's landlord's office, which didn't surprise me but gave me the confidence to draft an email so polite it creaked, asking whether the property manager would like to join us for a quick conversation about a curious discrepancy in signatures. Because if it turned out their staff had participated in even accidental fraud, I would hate to burden them with the reputational cost when a simple correction might spare everyone the paperwork, and within an hour I had a reply from a deputy manager suggesting we could meet at my parents' dining table if that made the family more comfortable, which told me Ethan had pressed them hard enough to make them nervous, and that their loyalty was not to him, but to the spreadsheet that measured exposure. I spent the afternoon arranging papers in a binder with tabs that would make a librarian weep with relief, including the certified letters, the bank scripts, the credit freeze notices, a printout of the county record showing a sworn statement ready for file if needed, and a clean sheet on which I wrote one sentence I planned to read like a line from a ledger: "I do not consent to be your guarantee." At 7 on the dot, my mother opened the door with that brittle hostess smile that says she has plated a roast to hold chaos at bay. My father hovered behind her with the calculator gaze he wears when reconciling the checkbook. Mark stepped in with the tense stiffness of a man who might finally be willing to see a room without its flattering shadows, and Ethan followed with a swagger that tried to be casual, but landed in the neighborhood of nervous, his eyes darting to the binder on the table, like a cat skirting a bathtub. I did not raise my voice, because a scalpel works where a hammer just makes a mess, and instead I asked the landlord's deputy to explain their onboarding process, their signature verification steps, and their policy regarding cosigners added after the fact. Then I laid down the printed image of the addendum beside 3 documents signed by me in the last year, angled the pages so even a tired person could see the differences without squinting, and rested my finger on the loop of the forged Y where Ethan's imitation had overstretched into pride. The deputy cleared his throat, acknowledged that the addendum had been submitted by the tenant with a scanned cosigner page attached, and that a staffer had assumed consent because of the familial relationship, and then, like a miracle no one prays for out loud, he handed Ethan a form rescinding the addendum along with a notice of lease review that would require a full deposit top-up within 10 days or immediate vacate, which meant that his balancing act had just lost its safety net. Mark, who hates chaos more than he loves romance, stared at the pages as if they were a field guide to a species he had been pretending did not exist, and when he finally looked up, the question in his eyes was not about me or even about us, but about whether he had hitched his reputation to a man who writes checks in air, so I did him the small courtesy of not adding commentary, because clarity stings more cleanly when dignity is left intact. My mother began a sentence about misunderstandings, my father muttered something about youthful judgment, Ethan tried to sit taller as if height could substitute for character, and I read my single sentence aloud with the notary stamp still damp on the affidavit in my bag, that I do not consent to be your guarantee, not for cars, not for leases, not for feelings you dress up as emergencies. And I watched the words land with the finality of a gavel. As the deputy left with their documents and the quiet rustle of a man grateful to be exiting a family theater, Mark asked if we could talk alone. Ethan scoffed about drama queens in houses with plastic-covered chairs. My mother reached for a camera with a reflex older than sense. And the front door opened on a gust of evening air as an uninvited guest stepped over the threshold, a creditor's representative with papers in a stiff envelope and the confident gait of someone who only visits when signatures matter, asking for Ethan by his full legal name, while Mark's phone, bright as a lighthouse, lit the room with a message whose preview line carried my name followed by a detail only he and I could recognize. The room rearranged itself around the envelope as if paper could tilt gravity, because the creditor's representative did not shout or threaten or even frown. He simply asked for my brother by his unabridged name and held out documents whose tone was colder than any voice. While my mother fluttered as though napkins could shield reputation, my father stared at the math written in legalese. And Ethan tried to laugh in the way men laugh when they hope sound will outpace consequence, yet the envelope did not care about charm, and the name on the line did not misspell itself into mercy, so I stepped back and let the formality pass from one hand to another, the ink landing where it had always intended to land. Mark's phone glowed at the edge of the table with a message preview that carried my name and, in a tiny string of words, the memory of a motel near the state line where we had once argued all night and reconciled at dawn over pancakes that tasted like relief. And the message was from the landlord's deputy, who had seen what forged signatures look like when daylight strikes them, offering to share copies of the addendum chain and the security notice, because he thought transparency might help calm the house, which meant that the evidence had begun to circulate like weather, and the forecast no longer respected my brother's umbrella. I looked at Mark and saw not the man who had chosen my brother over me, not even the man who had been flattered by Ethan's relentless attention, but a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, that stability is not a personality flaw and that loyalty, once mocked as dull, can burn through a room when it is betrayed, and I held his gaze long enough to watch his certainty lose its footing, which was a small kindness I allowed myself before I turned to the representative and asked, in a voice smooth enough to iron a shirt, whether acceptance of service here would suffice or whether we should step outside to spare my mother her dramatic sighs, and he answered with the polite finality of someone who has delivered worse, that the porch would do, so we moved. And the evening air smelled like lawn clippings and a distant barbecue while the neighborhood practiced pretending not to look. Ethan signed for the notice with a pen he tried to spin like a trick, the gesture failing twice, and when he pivoted back into the house, he announced to no one in particular that all of this was temporary and that real families do not behave like bureaucrats, which only made the papers crisper and the silence heavier. Mark asked me to walk with him to the backyard where the grass gave under our shoes and the fence leaned as if exhausted by decades of proximity. And he began the apologetic overture that men rehearse when the performance has ended and the audience has not yet left, telling me that he had been lonely, that Ethan had been noise in a quiet house, that he had mistaken disruption for relief and flattery for love, and I let him speak until the words stopped protecting him. Then I told him that the thing I could not forgive was not desire or confusion or even cowardice, but the decision to make me the villain inside my own life while he auditioned as the misunderstood hero, and that if he wanted absolution, he would find it only in a mirror he did not recognize. He asked whether there was any road back, any path that did not end at a courthouse or a car with its trunk open, and I told him a truth that surprised even me, that I did not know, because forgiveness and forgetting are not cousins. And because love without respect is just a sentimental habit, and while the answer hovered between us like a bridge that might hold and might not, we heard my mother calling for a family photo with that bright, frantic tone she uses when she senses history might be about to write a sentence she cannot edit. I stepped inside and found Ethan pacing as he texted someone whose patience was clearly thinner than his wallet, my father on the phone with the bank using a script I had typed that morning, my mother arranging us like chess pieces destined for stalemate. And I understood that the cleanest revenge might be the one that leaves everyone standing in the positions they chose until the floor beneath them clarifies what those choices cost. So when my mother lifted the phone and begged for smiles, I obliged with a curve of the mouth that did not disguise anything at all, and I asked Mark to stand where the light would not flatter him, and I asked Ethan to hold the envelope so the seal faced the camera. And I suggested that my father keep the notes from the bank visible since we all believe in accountability, and in that carefully composed frame I tucked a small truth that no one noticed until later, because on the sideboard behind us, next to the old family Bible and the candy dish that has been full of nothing for years, I placed the tidy binder whose spine read housekeeping and whose interior pocket contained notarized copies of the affidavit, the credit freezes, and a letter to the landlord rescinding the assumed cosign with language so measured it could serve tea, and then I clicked the shutter myself, offering to send the image to everyone so there would be no arguing over angles. The picture traveled faster than rumor, and before midnight I began receiving replies from aunts who had always suspected the saintly narrative was missing chapters, from cousins who had learned the hard way that silence is simply approval with a smaller vocabulary, from neighbors who finally named the whisper they had been cultivating as concern, and the house cracked a little in the soft places where denial lived. Ethan disappeared down a corridor of phone calls and half-promises Mark packed a small bag with a deliberateness that looked like either contrition or calculation. My mother retreated to the kitchen to polish the good spoons that never meet ordinary food, and my father sat with the calculator expression softened into something like thought. When the door finally closed behind Mark, he paused with the porch light bleaching him into a sketch and asked whether this was forgiveness or just weather passing, and I told him that some storms are seasonal and some redraw the coast. That family does come first when it behaves like a shelter and comes last when it behaves like a thief, and that I was done underwriting anyone's weather. Then I watched him walk into a night that did not promise anything beyond what he could carry. Later, in the quiet that follows the last guest and the uninvited truth, I washed the wine glasses my mother sets out when she wants a scene to look celebratory, and I felt neither triumph nor grief, but a cleaner kind of air. The kind you breathe after a storm when the yard is littered with branches and you can finally see the sky without the gauze of humidity, and I wondered, as I dried each glass with a towel that had survived more dinners than our illusions, whether I had simply traded one burden for another, because revenge, even when it is careful and principled and almost polite, leaves a ledger, and while I had not destroyed Ethan, I had certainly removed the scaffolding that held up his favorite fantasy. In the morning I would mail a final letter, a brief note to the creditor attaching a copy of the rescinded cosign and the forgery affidavit, and I would take a long walk past the lemon tree and the jogger and the dealership with the balloons, and I would feel, for at least a few blocks, like a woman who had chosen her own weather. Whether the storm had ended or merely shifted its coordinates, whether forgiveness would one day grow in the cleared ground, whether Mark would ever learn the difference between quiet and emptiness, those were questions I decided to leave unanswered for now. Because sometimes the most honest ending is the one that lets the horizon keep its secrets while you learn how to live with a sky that finally tells the truth.